Have you ever wondered how one single event could redraw the map of the world and change the course of history forever? Let's travel back to the early 20th century, a time of empires, new technologies, and simmering tensions. This is the story of the Great War, the war to end all wars, World War I. Before 1914, Europe was a complex web of alliances. On one side, you had the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Great Britain. On the other, the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These pacts were like a series of tripwires. If one country went to war, their allies were bound to join in. Think of it as a neighborhood dispute where everyone has promised to back up their friends, no matter what. This created a powder keg, and all it needed was a single spark. That spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting with his wife, Sophie. As their car drove through the streets, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped out from the crowd and fired 2 shots. Both the Archduke and his wife were killed. This assassination wasn't just a tragedy, it was the trigger. Austria-Hungary, furious, blamed Serbia and issued a harsh ultimatum. When Serbia couldn't meet all the demands, Austria-Hungary declared war. Suddenly, the tripwires were activated. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Serbia, began to mobilize its massive army. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, saw Russia's mobilization as a threat and declared war on Russia. Then Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally, and launched an invasion through neutral Belgium to get to Paris quickly. This invasion of Belgium was the final straw for Great Britain, which declared war on Germany. Within a few weeks, the great powers of Europe were locked in a devastating conflict. What started as a regional crisis had exploded into a world war. Everyone thought the war would be over by Christmas. The soldiers marched off with smiles and cheers, expecting a short, glorious adventure. They were wrong. The conflict quickly bogged down into something the world had never seen before: trench warfare. On the Western Front, which stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, armies dug a vast network of trenches. Life in these trenches was horrific. Soldiers lived in mud and filth, surrounded by disease, rats, and the constant threat of death. The space between the opposing trenches was called no man's land. It was a barren wasteland of craters, barbed wire, and fallen soldiers. Generals would order massive assaults, sending thousands of men over the top to charge across no man's land, straight into machine gun fire and artillery shells. The result was catastrophic loss of life for very little gain. Battles like the Somme and Verdun became infamous for their staggering casualties, with millions killed or wounded for just a few miles of territory. The war wasn't just fought in the trenches, it was a global conflict. Battles raged in Eastern Europe between Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening up fronts in the Middle East. Colonies in Africa and Asia were also drawn into the fighting, providing soldiers and resources for their European rulers. The war also took to the seas, with powerful navies like Britain's and Germany's clashing for control of the waves. German U-boats or submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant and military ships alike. Technology transformed the battlefield. Machine guns, which could fire hundreds of rounds a minute, made charging across open ground suicidal. Heavy artillery could rain down explosive shells from miles away, pulverizing fortifications and morale. Poison gas, a terrifying new weapon, was used by both sides, causing agonizing death and injury. Tanks were introduced by the British, clanking across no man's land, designed to break through barbed wire and enemy lines. Airplanes, a brand new invention, were initially used for reconnaissance but soon evolved into dogfighting fighters and bombers. This was the first truly industrial war, where the factory was just as important as the front line. For years, the war was a brutal stalemate. But by 1917, 2 major events shifted the balance. First, Russia, crippled by massive casualties, food shortages, and political unrest, experienced a revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and pulled Russia out of the war. This was a huge victory for Germany, which could now move its troops from the Eastern Front to the West. But just as one power was leaving, another was entering. The United States had remained neutral for years, though it had been supplying the Allies with weapons and money. However, Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which included the sinking of American ships, and the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal for an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., outraged the American public. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The arrival of fresh American troops and vast industrial resources gave the exhausted Allies a decisive advantage. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched one last, massive offensive on the Western Front, hoping to win the war before the full weight of American power could be felt. The offensive made initial gains but ultimately failed. The German army was exhausted, and its people were starving due to the Allied naval blockade. With American troops pouring into France, the tide turned for good. The Allied forces launched a counteroffensive, and the German lines began to crumble. One by one, Germany's allies Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary surrendered. Faced with military defeat and revolution at home, the German Kaiser abdicated. The new German government requested an armistice, a ceasefire. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The Great War was over. The aftermath was devastating. Over 15 million people, both soldiers and civilians, were dead. Entire empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the German, and the Russian, were gone. The map of Europe was redrawn, creating new countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The leaders of the victorious nations met in Paris to negotiate the peace. The resulting Treaty of Versailles placed the full blame for the war on Germany and imposed harsh reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions. While intended to prevent future conflict, many historians argue the treaty's severe terms created resentment in Germany that would later contribute to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II just 2 decades later. It was a brutal lesson in the human cost of conflict, a memory that reminds us of the fragility of peace.